Hello, welcome to Quipper Video. In this chapter, you will describe sexual reproduction in plants and illustrate the relationships among structures of flowers, fruits, and seeds. Remember that plants are generally classified into two groups based on their mode of reproduction. Plants can reproduce either asexually or sexually. Their main difference depends on whether the plants require fusion of gametes or fertilization to reproduce. In this chapter, we will focus on the type of reproduction which requires fusion of gametes, and that is sexual reproduction. Sexual reproduction in plants depends on the type of plant, whether they are angiosperms or gymnosperms. Angiosperms, which are also called flowering plants, are plants that have seeds within the ovary, while gymnosperms have naked seeds on the surface of their leaves or scales. Let us first look into the world of angiosperms. Flowers are the sexual reproductive organs in angiosperms. They consist of the androecium, the male reproductive structure, and gynoecium, the female reproductive structure. Androecium is the male reproductive structure that consists of whorls of stamen. The stamen is comprised of the filament, which is a long, slender stalk that holds the anther. The anther produces the pollen grains, or the male reproductive cells. Gynoecium is the female reproductive structure composed of carpels. It may consist of a single carpel, monocarpellary, or it may have several carpels, multicarpellary. The carpel is made up of the stigma, the style, and the ovary. The style is a slender stalk that supports the stigma. The stigma is the sticky part that receives the pollen. The ovary is the basal sac that contains the ovules, or the female reproductive cells. Both the male and female reproductive cells of the flowers are non-motile. So how do they unite? The cells are brought together by pollination. Pollination is the union of the male and female reproductive cells. It takes place when the pollen grains from the male anther are transferred to the female stigma. There are three types of pollination. There are autogamy, gatenogamy, and xenogamy. Autogamy is a type of pollination where pollen grains are transferred to the stigma of the same flower. It is also referred to as self-pollination. On the other hand, gatenogamy is a type of pollination where pollen grains are transferred to the stigma of another flower of the same plant. Finally, xenogamy, also called cross-pollination, is a type of pollination where pollen grains are transferred to the stigma of a different plant. Pollination is made possible through different agents. Abiotic agents are non-living things that aid in pollination. They include wind and water. On the other hand, biotic agents are living things that aid in pollination. They include animals and humans. After pollination, if the received pollen is of the right type, the gynoecium recognizes and accepts the pollen to promote post-pollination events that lead to fertilization. Fertilization takes place when the sperm or germinated pollen unites with the egg, forming a fertilized egg called zygote. The first step in fertilization requires the attachment of the pollen to the stigma. Each pollen grain becomes a part of the pollen tube, which grows down the neck of the style and reaches the ovary. Sperm cells are discharged into the embryo sac, fertilizing the ovule. Do you know that a double fertilization may also occur? This happens when the pollen grain enters the ovary and releases 2 sperm cells. The process of double fertilization starts when the pollen grains stick to the stigma. The pollen tube grows along the style. The pollen tube then penetrates the micropyle, or opening of the ovule. Once inside the ovule or the embryo sac, one of the sperm fertilizes the egg, forming a diploid zygote. The other sperm fertilizes the polar nuclei, forming the triploid endosperm. This endosperm will become the food source of the growing embryo. During post-fertilization, the zygote develops into an embryo, while the endosperm nucleus develops into the endosperm. The endosperm is the part of the seed that acts as a food store for the developing embryo. After fertilization, the ovule, which contains the embryo and the endosperm, matures into a seed, while the ovary forms the pericarp, or the flesh of the fruit. The seed is the beginning of the next generation. It grows into a seedling and then into a mature plant. The mature plant then produces flowers that contain the reproductive cells. Let us discuss reproduction in another type of plant, the gymnosperms. Unlike angiosperms, gymnosperms do not have flowers and fruits. Their ovules, which become seeds, are on the surface of a scale or a modified leaf. Examples of gymnosperms include cycads and conifers. So how does reproduction take place in gymnosperms? Most gymnosperms have reproductive parts called cones. They produce 2 kinds of cones, the male and the female cones. The male cones produce the pollen, while the female cones contain at least 1 ovule. The pollen and the ovule meet through pollination. In gymnosperms, the main pollinating agent is wind. Wind carries the pollen from the male cones to the female cones. When the pollen reaches a female cone, a sticky substance secreted by the ovule collects the pollen. After pollination, the ovule closes and seals in the pollen. 1 sperm cell fertilizes the egg cell, forming a zygote. The fertilized egg develops into an embryo, and the other parts of the ovule mature into the seed coat and endosperm. When the seed is planted in a fertile ground, it develops into a new plant. Let's recall what you have learned today. We learned that some plants reproduce by sexual reproduction. Sexual reproduction depends on the type of plant. In angiosperms, the reproductive cells are produced and stored in flowers. In gymnosperms, the reproductive cells are produced and stored in cones. In the next chapter, you will learn about the asexual reproduction in animals. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video.